Hello everybody and welcome to another session of Bigfoot Tales. Today we're going to jump on the tour bus and head down to Arizona and the Grand Canyon area for what may have been a Grand Canyon Bigfoot incident. Excuse me, I want to clarify a couple of items here before I get into the article though, and discussion around it. I want to state that a lot of these stories may or may not be true. We don't know how many of these are actually written as they occurred in a factual manner, and how many of them have been, aggrandized or added to or improved, if you want to use that term, to make them sound like a better story. We obviously can't go back to, over 100 years ago and talk to the person that wrote the story. These people aren't alive anymore, and so we have to just kind of take them as they are and, enjoy them for the literature that they've turned out to be. Second thing is, I want to talk a brief moment, on Bigfoot here. And I think one of the problems that we have is that we keep envisioning a Bigfoot as being, like 10 to 15 feet high. My opinion, for what it's worth, and again, it's just my opinion, I don't actually believe that there are that many of them that are that high. I think that is the exception rather than the norm. From all of the incidents that I've heard about and read about, all the sightings reports, I'm going to suggest that a closer average height of these things are going to be more like 6.5 to 7.5 feet. For the norm, and again, that's just my opinion. Nobody knows for sure until we actually have one of these critters in a cage where we can take samples off of them and study them. We're never going to know. And if it does turn out to be a human being, then, well, we'll have to discuss that moral implication when we get to it. But again, there's a lot of different things that we have to look at here, and I want you to know that these stories are for entertainment purposes, as well as for demonstration purposes to kind of discuss the history of the wild man. He didn't just pop into being in the 1950s, or they just didn't, crawl out of the dirt and become a real creature back in the early 1900s. They've been around for thousands of years. A lot of stories about them, but up until 1900 or so, they've always been referred to as wild men, and even up and past that, probably until I would say after Fred Beck's incident at the cabin in British Columbia, where they referred to as apes in the 1920s. So prior to 1920, I would say without exception, these Bigfoot creatures were referred to as wild men. But let's get into the article. I've already probably spent far too much of your time rambling, but I found this one in several different places. One of them, the earliest dated one, was in the Davenport Daily Republican from June 13th to 1903. Then there was another one from the Stansted Journal, July 23rd, 1903. And both of these articles were essentially the same, and in the other locations of the newspapers that carried the story were very little change. Some of them had a couple of paragraphs taken out of them for space reasons, but essentially the same. But it's entitled "An Arizona Wild Man," and we'll get right into the article here. An Arizona Wild Man. Many strange stories have been told of the wild man of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, and while some persons have credited these weird tales, they have, for the most part, been regarded as the ingenious inventions of imaginative travelers, and have passed into tradition as such. But, according to I.W. Stevens of Cedar, Colorado, the wild man is not a myth, and he gives a thrilling account of an encounter he had with the creature. 2 years ago, says Mr. Stevens, I had business in the northwestern part of Arizona that took me in the neighborhood of the extreme lower end of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River in Mohave County, Arizona. Having the misfortune of getting my arm broken, I took a trip to the river to kill time and to catch a few beaver. I constructed a skiff and with the aid of a friend, and when my arm got strong enough, I took a trip up the canyon as far as I could go with a boat. A few miles above the entrance, I hauled my boat upon the sand and got ready to examine the rock walls. The first thing that attracted my attention was the imprint of bare feet in the sand. Thinking the tracks had been made by some Indians, perhaps a Paiute or Halapai, I began looking the gorge over with much interest. Going downstream a short distance, I found more tracks. The third day of my stay, I saw the head of a man on a bench of rocks on the north side of the river. Evidently, he was seated on the edge of a cliff some distance above my camp. I rode upstream a little above the point where I saw the man's head and part of his shoulders above the greasewood brush. Climbing up to the bench, I had some difficulty in finding a place that I could get over the ledge and be on a level with my strange neighbor. I finally succeeded in approaching closer to the point. I saw, sitting on a large boulder, a man with long white hair and a matted beard that reached to his knees. The creature was unaware of my approach, and I gazed up upon him for some moments unobserved. He was about 50 yards away and in full view. He wore no clothing, and upon his talon-like fingers were claws at least 2 inches long. A coat of gray hair nearly covered his body, with here and there a spot of dirty skin showing. I had found the wild man of the rocks. At that moment, a rock, loosened by some animal, came rolling down. The creature turned his face towards me. Horrors! What a face! It was seared and burned brown by the sun, with fiery green eyes. With a wild whoop and a leap, he was off up over the rocks and cliffs like a mountain sheep for about 75 yards. Then he stopped. He was armed with a queer-shaped club, large enough to fell an ox. Brandishing this bludgeon, he shrieked and chattered for a moment, then started towards me, roaring and still flourishing his weapon. Faster and faster he came, and my hair began to stiffen. I am a poor runner, so I stood my ground. When the creature was within about 15 yards of me, I raised my rifle to fire, thinking to cripple him. As I first glanced along the barrel, I heard a deep growl just above the wild man. Looking up, I saw a she-cougar and 2 half-grown cubs. The mother cougar crouched, with tail lashing, ready to spring on the wild man. He also had heard the growl, and he braced himself for the shock. I drew a hasty bead on the cougar and pressed the trigger. When the smoke had cleared away, the mother cougar lay dead where the wild man had stood. The man himself had disappeared. The 2 young cougars were still on the rock, apparently greatly frightened by the report and echoes of my old Sharps rifle. Reaching hastily for a cartridge, I found I had neglected to buckle on my belt when leaving camp, so I hastily retreated to the boat, where I found everything as I had left it. I shoved the boat off and drifted toward camp, which was near the cougars. There lay the old cougar where she had fallen. The wild man was standing over the 2 cubs, which were also dead, he having beaten the life out of them with his club. He stood for a moment, gazing on the carcasses, then got down on his hands and knees and drank the warm blood as it flowed from the death wounds. The sight sickened me. I stood up in the old boat and yelled. The man sprang to his feet, took a long look at me, then fled up from the ledge to ledge until he reached the 4th ledge, where he stopped. Here he flourished his club again and screamed the wildest, most unearthly screech I ever heard, then turned and sprang onward up the craggy wall of the canyon. Not fancying my wild neighbor, I packed my outfit into the boat and drifted down and out of the canyon before I made camp for the night. That was the strangest adventure of my life. Tradition records that, years ago, hostile Indians captured 3 men, bound them to logs far up the canyon, and set them to drift upon the swollen river. It may be that this wild creature is one of those unfortunate men who, by chance, freed himself and escaped death, but was made insane by his awful experience. That's out of the Albuquerque, New Mexico Journal-Democrat, where it originated. That's the end of the story and the article. And we've got a couple of things to look at here. This wild man of the Grand Canyon. And again, I want to reiterate that, up until around 1920, these wild men were always referred to as men and not animals. So we have to take that as history as it is. I think here the big things that we have to look at is, number one, the appearance of him. He had long hair, had a long beard, which a lot of humans do, of course. But he was all covered with gray hair on his body. There were a few patches showing. The story referred to his fingers as more like talons, covered with claws that were 2 inches long. That's pretty long. I don't know how many of you have long fingernails, but I find that if I don't clip my nails every few days, when they get very long, they start to break. So it's kind of strange to me that he would be able to go about with in the wilds with 2-inch long fingernails, especially if they look like claws. Now, obviously, he was naked, didn't wear any clothes. I think one of the most astounding parts of this description that this man gives of this creature that he saw was his face. And I repeat, at that moment, a rock loosened by some animal came rolling down. The creature turned his face towards me. Horrors, what a face! It was seared and burned brown by the sun, with fiery green eyes. I wonder if, in fact, that the face wasn't really seared brown by the sun, but it was more leathery looking because that's the way his face looked. We have a lot of Bigfoot reports that suggest that the skin on their face was leather-like and dark. So this kind of matches a lot of today's descriptions of Bigfoot. And his fiery green eyes. We don't get a lot of eye descriptions of Bigfoot today. We do have a few incidences where green eyes are reported. But this is more of an odd color for animals. Fiery green is a pretty bright eye, and especially if you can see it that plainly from that distance. He was 50 yards is 150 feet. So that's a pretty good description for being that far away. To have to mention that his eyes are fiery green. He also had a queer-shaped club that was large enough to fill an ox. I don't know how many of you are farm people, but cattle or cows, whatever you want to call them, depending upon what part of the country you're from, that have become ox are really big. They're several thousand pounds. Some of them are really big ones, but it takes quite a bit to kill them with a bludgeon. So had to have been really big. As far as the vocalizations of this critter goes, or person, he shrieked and chattered, but more importantly, he had a wild whoop and a leap, and he was up off over the rocks. We hear a lot of stories today, or suggestions that they speak in whoops. But I wonder if maybe they're not actually speaking when they say whoop, but it's more of a surprised expression rather than a means of direct communications. For instance, like if you walk across a wool carpet in your or a carpet in your wool socks and you touch a light switch and you get a shock and you go yow or ouch or whatever. That sort of a thing. I wonder if maybe what these whoops are that we're hearing is not really just a communication specifically directed to another Bigfoot, but more of a surprise type of thing. But in with that whoop, we do have to include in this discussion the idea that there are a lot of people today that insist that Bigfoot is indeed an ape, and they equate the whoops with monkey-like sounds or chimpanzee-like communications. But if you go back in history, and of course, like I said, I'm not a Bigfoot expert. Nobody really is, actually. But I'm primarily, as far as what I like to be referred to as a folklorist / historian. So when I look at these stories, I go back into the historical aspects of a lot of this stuff, and find that a lot of the Indians did a lot of whooping when they had their war cries, and when they were excited. So I think this might have some sort of a connection. I really don't know for certain. It's just speculation on my part here. But anyways, again, I'm going to suggest at this point, judging by the fact that this was human-like, bipedal obviously, carried a club, hard to carry a club if you're going to run around on all fours, was human-looking, but yet not human-looking. Some of the description was more of a Bigfoot description. He did not speak in any intelligible language, but rather shrieked and chattered. And we hear in some of the samurai vocalizations that we've mostly heard, or most of us have heard, is just simply chatter. So there's a lot of similarities in this story that nicely fit into some of today's Bigfoot description. So, but anyhow, that's the article for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you remember to comment, rate, and subscribe, and share this video around, and maybe we can come to an acceptable conclusion of this puzzle as to what Bigfoot is, and eventually come to find him, and not necessarily put him in the box, but put him in the place on the zoological charts that he actually belongs. Whether that be as a human or some sort of an animal, don't know, but we'll find out at some point in time, I believe. And that's it for today. Enjoy, and as always, we'll see you next time on Bigfoot Tales.